Section 1. The Paradox of Victory. Late July, 1944. The verdant hedgerows of Normandy, for weeks a labyrinth of bitter contest, had finally begun to yield. Operation Cobra, a thunderous assertion of Allied air and ground power, had punched a hole in the German lines, and through that gap poured the relentless might of the United States Third Army. The air, thick with the scent of churned earth and summer blossoms, now carried a new sound: the unending growl of engines. Tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks surged forward, a river of olive-drab steel flowing deep into the heart of France. For the soldiers on the ground, this was the moment they had trained for, the culmination of years of preparation. The liberation of Europe, once a distant dream discussed in hushed tones in English pubs and American training camps, was now unfolding at a breathtaking pace. General George S. Patton, a figure of boundless energy and ambition, was in his element, his armored columns devouring mile after mile of French countryside. The speed was intoxicating, a dizzying blur of liberated towns, cheering civilians, and retreating enemy forces. Each new dawn brought another village freed, another bridge crossed, another objective secured. The momentum felt unstoppable, a force of nature that was sweeping away the vestiges of a 4-year occupation. This was the modern way of war, a symphony of speed and firepower, the very doctrine that the German army had perfected and unleashed upon Europe 4 years prior. Now, that same strategy was being turned against its masters with devastating effect. The initial German strategy, the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was predicated on rapid, decisive armored thrusts that would shatter an enemy's command structure and sow chaos deep behind their lines. It relied on overwhelming the opponent before they could mount a coherent defense. And for a time, it had seemed invincible. But the architects of that strategy knew its secret vulnerability, its Achilles heel: logistics. A tank without fuel is merely a steel pillbox. A soldier without ammunition is a defenseless man. An army without food cannot fight. The further and faster an army advances, the longer and more tenuous its supply line becomes. It is a fundamental paradox of warfare. Every mile gained is another mile that supplies must travel to reach the front. The advance itself consumes the very resources needed to sustain it. In the early days of the breakout from Normandy, this paradox was a distant concern. The Allied supply depots were clustered near the landing beaches, a stone's throw from the front lines. The logistical chain was short, robust, and efficient. Trucks laden with fuel, food, and ammunition could make the round trip in a matter of hours. But as Patton's tanks raced towards Paris and beyond, that simple equation began to change dramatically. The front line was no longer a few dozen miles from the beaches. It was now 100, then 200, then 300 miles away. The journey for a single supply truck transformed from a short-haul delivery into a grueling, multi-day expedition. The roads, many of them narrow country lanes never intended for heavy military traffic, were crumbling under the strain. They were choked with the wreckage of earlier battles and the constant, two-way flow of military vehicles. The French railway system, a potential solution, had been systematically targeted by Allied air power and the French resistance in the months leading up to the invasion to prevent the Germans from reinforcing their positions. The very success of that preparatory campaign now became a major obstacle. The ports themselves, particularly the deep-water port of Cherbourg, had been heavily damaged by the retreating German forces, limiting the rate at which new supplies could be brought ashore. The Allied command, led by General Eisenhower, found itself facing a crisis born of its own success. The glorious advance that was making headlines around the world was in danger of grinding to a halt, not because of enemy resistance, but from simple, unglamorous starvation of resources. The combat troops at the tip of the spear were performing miracles, but they were running on fumes. Fuel was becoming the most precious commodity in the European theater. Tank commanders began to ration their movements, making agonizing choices about which objectives to pursue and which to bypass. Artillery batteries carefully counted their shells, knowing that each one fired might not be easily replaced. The momentum, so crucial to the Allied strategy, was beginning to falter. The specter of a stalemate, a return to the static trench warfare of the First World War, loomed large. The German High Command, watching from a distance, understood this dynamic perfectly. They had lived it. They were counting on it. They knew that the Allied logistical chain was stretched to its breaking point, and they were preparing to exploit that weakness. The war in the West was about to transform from a battle of firepower and maneuver into a battle of logistics, a contest of industrial will and organizational genius. And on the desolate, war-torn roads of France, a solution of unprecedented scale and audacity was about to be born. A solution that would change the course of the war and become a legend in the annals of military history. The Great Allied Breakout was not just a test of arms. It was a test of endurance, and the outcome hung precariously in the balance. Section 2. The German Calculation. From the vantage point of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, the situation in late summer 1944 was viewed through a lens of grim experience. While the speed and ferocity of the Allied breakout from Normandy were alarming, they were not entirely unexpected. What the German general saw was not an unstoppable juggernaut, but a familiar pattern repeating itself, a mirror image of their own campaigns in the early years of the war. They were, in essence, watching their own strategic doctrine being used against them, and they believed they knew exactly how it would end. Their confidence was rooted in their bitter education on the Eastern Front. In 1941, Operation Barbarossa had been the ultimate expression of the Blitzkrieg philosophy. German panzer divisions had sliced through Soviet lines, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, encircling entire armies. The advance was breathtaking, seemingly on the verge of total victory. But as the autumn rains began to fall, turning the unpaved Russian roads into impassable rivers of mud, the advance slowed, sputtered, and eventually froze in the brutal grip of the Russian winter just miles from Moscow. The culprit was not the Red Army, which had been shattered and disorganized, but the tyranny of distance. The German supply lines, stretched over 1,000 miles from their railheads in Poland, simply collapsed. Fuel, winter clothing, ammunition, and spare parts could not reach the front. The mighty panzer divisions, the most feared fighting force in the world, were immobilized, their engines silent for want of gasoline. The soldiers, clad in summer uniforms, faced the unforgiving cold. The lesson was seared into the consciousness of every German commander. An army, no matter how powerful or well-led, is tethered to its supply chain. Speed creates a logistical debt that must eventually be paid. Now, in France, they saw the Americans and their allies making the same perceived mistake. They watched with a mixture of concern and grim satisfaction as Patton's Third Army raced across the countryside. They tracked the lengthening distance between the front lines and the Normandy beaches. They calculated the fuel consumption of a Sherman tank, the daily ammunition requirements of an infantry division, the sheer tonnage of food needed to feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Their own intelligence reports confirmed the state of the French infrastructure. They knew the railways were a wreck. They knew the ports were operating at a fraction of their capacity. They knew the roads were inadequate for the task. Their strategy, therefore, began to shift from one of direct confrontation to one of strategic patience. Instead of throwing their dwindling reserves into costly head-on battles to stop the Allied advance, they opted for a fighting withdrawal. They would trade space for time. They would cede ground, forcing the Allies to extend their supply lines even further. They would harass the columns, conduct raids, and force the Allied spearheads to consume fuel and ammunition in small, indecisive skirmishes. The German generals envisioned a scenario where the Allied armies would, in a matter of weeks, literally run out of gas. They imagined the American armored columns, so impressive in their headlong charge, coming to a sputtering, ignominious halt somewhere in eastern France, their tanks sitting idle in the fields, their guns silent. This, they believed, would be the moment to strike. Once the Allied giant was winded and vulnerable, the remaining German panzer divisions, carefully husbanded for this very purpose, would launch a powerful counterattack. They would strike the overextended flanks, cut off the spearheads, and inflict a devastating defeat that could potentially change the course of the war in the West. This was not wishful thinking. It was a strategy based on sound military principles and their own hard-won experience. They had seen it happen before. They failed to account for one crucial difference, however. The Germany that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 was a nation whose industrial might was formidable, but ultimately finite. The United States, in contrast, was an industrial behemoth of a scale the world had never before witnessed. While German planners thought in terms of divisions and available fuel reserves, American planners thought in terms of assembly lines, production quotas, and continental logistics. The German High Command was playing a game of military chess, anticipating their opponent's next move based on the traditional rules of the game. They did not fully comprehend that their opponent was about to overturn the chessboard entirely, introducing a piece with capabilities they had never conceived of. They looked at the long, fragile Allied supply line and saw a fatal weakness. They failed to see it as a problem that the Americans would not just manage, but solve with overwhelming brute force ingenuity. They heard the reports of Allied fuel shortages and saw confirmation of their strategy. They did not yet hear the distant, growing rumble of thousands upon thousands of engines that were being marshaled for a task of unimaginable scale. They were waiting for the great Allied machine to run down, unaware that an even greater machine was being built behind the lines, a machine designed for the singular purpose of never, ever letting that happen. Their calculations were logical, their strategy sound, but their premise was flawed. They were preparing for a war of scarcity against an enemy that was about to unleash a war of abundance. Section 3. The Birth of the Red Ball Express. By mid-August 1944, the logistical crisis facing the Allied Expeditionary Force had reached a tipping point. The triumphant advance was becoming a victim of its own success. A staff officer for General Patton famously summarized the situation with a stark report. "The Third Army is advancing, and the tanks are running well, but we are developing a serious gasoline problem." This was a colossal understatement. Some armored divisions were consuming over 300,000 gallons of fuel per day, and the supply system was delivering less than half that amount. The situation demanded a radical solution, a complete rethinking of how a modern army was sustained in the field. The conventional methods, relying on railways and establishing a slow, methodical chain of supply depots, were too slow. The momentum of the breakout was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and to lose it due to logistical shortfalls would be a strategic catastrophe. The challenge fell to the senior logisticians of the Allied command, men who operated far from the front lines, but whose work was just as critical as that of any combat commander. They gathered in hastily established headquarters, poring over maps of France, calculating tonnage requirements, and debating impossibly complex transportation schedules. The problem was clear. The only way to get the vast quantities of supplies from the Normandy ports to the rapidly advancing armies 300 miles away was by road. The railways were out of commission for the foreseeable future, and air transport could only deliver a tiny fraction of what was needed. The solution had to be a massive, continuous convoy system, an operation of unprecedented scale and complexity. The concept was championed by senior officers in the Army's services of supply, under the command of Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee. They envisioned a superhighway dedicated exclusively to military logistics, a non-stop conveyor belt of trucks running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The plan was audacious, bordering on impossible. It would require thousands of vehicles, thousands of drivers, and an extraordinary level of coordination. On August 21, 1944, the decision was made. The operation was officially designated the Red Ball Express. The name was borrowed from American railroad terminology. In the 19th century, railroad workers would mark rail cars containing priority freight with a large red circle or red ball to ensure they were not sidetracked and were moved to their destination as quickly as possible. The name was a perfect encapsulation of the mission's urgency and importance. The planning was frantic. The first convoys were scheduled to run in just 4 days. Colonel Loren Tot Ayers, a veteran transportation officer, was put in charge of the operational details. He and his team worked around the clock, mapping out the routes. They designated 2 main highways running from Cherbourg and the Normandy Beach depots eastward towards the supply hub at Chartres. To maximize efficiency and prevent catastrophic traffic jams, they made a revolutionary decision. The Red Ball routes would be one-way circuits. One main road would be used exclusively for eastbound traffic, carrying full trucks to the front. A parallel route would be designated for westbound traffic, for empty trucks returning to the ports for another load. Civilian traffic was strictly forbidden on these roads. Even other military traffic was prohibited, unless it had special authorization. The Red Ball Express was to have absolute priority. Road signs were hastily painted, large red circles on a white background, and erected along the entire length of the routes. Military police units were tasked with manning checkpoints at every major intersection to keep the traffic flowing and enforce the one-way rule. An intricate system of dispatching, scheduling, and tracking was devised on the fly. Convoys of at least 5 trucks, led by a jeep in the front and a jeep in the rear, were to be dispatched at regular intervals. They were instructed to maintain a constant speed of 25 miles per hour and to keep a 60-yard distance between vehicles to minimize the risk of chain reaction collisions or losses from a potential enemy attack. The entire operation was a massive gamble. It required commandeering a significant portion of the Army's available truck companies, vehicles that were also needed for countless other tasks behind the lines. It relied on the ability of drivers to endure grueling, non-stop schedules under incredibly stressful conditions. It depended on maintenance crews being able to keep thousands of vehicles running on war-torn roads. Many seasoned officers were skeptical, viewing the plan as a desperate, unworkable improvisation. But desperation was a powerful motivator. The armies of Generals Patton and Bradley were on the verge of outrunning their supplies. The Red Ball Express was not just a good idea. It was the only idea. On the morning of August 25, 1944, just 84 days after the D-Day landings, the first convoy of the Red Ball Express rolled out of its staging area. The drivers, many of whom had only been given a few hours of briefing, climbed into the cabs of their trucks, the engines rumbling to life in the pre-dawn darkness. They were embarking on a mission that had no precedent, a logistical marathon that would push men and machines to their absolute limits. They were the pioneers of a new kind of warfare, a war won not just with guns and tanks, but with gasoline, grit, and the relentless rhythm of the open road. The great railroad on wheels had begun to move. Section 4. The Workhorse, the GMC CCKW. The Red Ball Express was a triumph of human organization and endurance, but at its heart, it was an operation powered by machines. The entire concept rested on the performance of one specific piece of equipment, a vehicle so ubiquitous and essential to the Allied war effort that it became an icon of American industrial might, the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck. To the soldiers who drove it, fixed it, and relied on it for their very survival, It was known affectionately and universally as the Deuce and a Half. This was the undisputed workhorse of the Allied armies, the logistical backbone that carried the fight from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. The Deuce and a Half was not a particularly glamorous vehicle. It was slab-sided, utilitarian, and designed for function over form. But it was a masterpiece of rugged, reliable engineering. Produced by the General Motors Corporation, its official designation, CCKW, was a code for its specifications. C for a vehicle designed in 1941, C for a conventional cab, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. This six-wheel drive configuration gave it exceptional off-road capability, allowing it to navigate the muddy fields and shell-cratered roads of France, where lesser vehicles would become hopelessly bogged down. Under the hood was a GMC 270 cubic inch inline six-cylinder engine, a power plant renowned not for its high speed, but for its tremendous torque and near indestructible reliability. It was an engine that was easy to maintain in the field, a crucial feature when mechanical support was stretched thin. The truck was designed to carry a cargo of 5,000 pounds, or 2.5 tons, but it was notoriously over-engineered. In the desperate circumstances of the Red Ball Express, it was common for crews to load their trucks with double that weight, piling on cans of fuel and crates of ammunition until the leaf springs groaned in protest. Yet, the Deuce and a Half almost always delivered. It was a testament to the quality of its construction and the robust simplicity of its design. The scale of its production was staggering and provides a window into the sheer industrial capacity of the United States during the war. More than 562,000 Deuce and a Half trucks were built and deployed across every theater of war. They were a constant presence, a symbol of America's ability to project power, not just through combat force, but through overwhelming logistical support. For the Red Ball Express, the Army assembled a fleet of nearly 6,000 of these trucks. They were drawn from every available transportation unit in the theater. The trucks were simple, but the operation was not. To keep this massive fleet running required a Herculean maintenance effort. Ordnance companies were stationed at regular intervals along the Red Ball routes, operating makeshift, open-air garages. These mechanics worked around the clock, performing miracles with limited tools and a dwindling supply of spare parts. Tire changes were a constant battle. The roads, littered with debris from the fighting, shredded tires at an alarming rate. Mechanics would often have to patch and repair tires rather than replace them, just to keep a truck in the convoy. Engine overhauls, transmission repairs, and axle replacements were performed in muddy fields under the dim glow of portable lamps. The Deuce and a Half's simplicity was its saving grace. Its components were largely interchangeable, and its systems were straightforward enough that a determined mechanic could often get a disabled truck running again in a matter of hours. The drivers developed a deep, personal connection with their vehicles. They learned the unique sounds of their engines, the specific feel of the clutch, the particular way the steering pulled to one side. A driver's truck was his office, his dining room, and often his bedroom during the brief, infrequent stops. They drove with the windows down or removed entirely to improve visibility and to help them stay awake during the long, monotonous hours. There was no power steering, no synchronized transmission, and the ride was punishingly rough. Driving a fully loaded Deuce and a Half for 18 hours straight was a physically demanding ordeal that left a man's arms and back aching with fatigue. But the trucks became a source of pride. They were a tangible link to the front, the physical embodiment of the supply line. Every crate of ammunition, every 5-gallon jerry can of gasoline was a direct contribution to the advance. The German panzer divisions had their technologically superior Tiger and Panther tanks, but the Allies had the Deuce and a Half, a humble truck that, through its sheer numbers and unwavering reliability, represented a more decisive strategic advantage. It was the weapon that fueled the weapons, the machine that sustained the machine of war. The Red Ball Express would have been impossible without it. It was the steady, thrumming heart of the entire operation, a six-wheeled testament to the idea that victory in modern war is forged not only on the battlefield, but on the assembly line and the long, dusty road to the front. Section 5. The Men Behind the Wheel. The story of the Red Ball Express is not just a story of strategy and machinery. It is, above all, a human story. The thousands of trucks that formed the lifeblood of the Allied advance were not autonomous vehicles. Each one was guided by a driver, a soldier whose battlefield was a winding, treacherous ribbon of asphalt, and whose primary weapon was a steering wheel. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were the unsung heroes of the campaign in Western Europe, ordinary men tasked with an extraordinary burden. They faced grueling conditions, constant danger, and a level of physical and mental exhaustion that pushed them to the very limits of human endurance. A significant and vital portion of this force, approximately 75% of the drivers, were African American soldiers. At a time when the United States military was still racially segregated, these men were often relegated to service and support roles, far from the perceived glory of the front lines. The Red Ball Express, however, thrust them into a role of paramount importance. While they may not have been in direct combat, their mission was every bit as critical and fraught with peril. For these soldiers, the Red Ball Express was an opportunity to prove their patriotism, skill, and courage in a way that the segregated system often denied them. They took immense pride in their work, understanding that the fuel and ammunition they carried were essential for their fellow soldiers, both black and white, at the front. The daily routine for a Red Ball driver was a monotonous and punishing cycle. There were no set shifts in the traditional sense. A driver would often stay with his truck for the entire round trip, a journey that could take several days. Sleep was a luxury, snatched in brief, hour-long increments, while waiting for a convoy to form or for a truck to be refueled. They drove through the day under the summer sun and through the night in near total blackout conditions, with only a tiny slit of light from their cat's-eye headlamps to pierce the darkness. The mental strain was immense. The endless drone of the engine, the vibration of the cab, and the constant focus required to navigate the damaged roads created a state of profound fatigue. Drivers would sing, talk to themselves, or chew tobacco, anything to fight off the heavy pull of sleep. They knew that a moment of inattention could send their truck careening into a ditch or into the vehicle in front of them, creating a disastrous pileup that could halt the flow of supplies for hours. Physical exhaustion was their constant companion. Their diet consisted mostly of cold sea rations, eaten in the driver's seat. The roads were rough, and every bump and pothole sent a jolt through the unforgiving suspension of the deuce and a half. Many drivers developed chronic back pain and joint aches from the ceaseless jarring. Beyond the fatigue, there was the ever-present danger. While the Red Ball routes were behind the main front lines, they were by no means safe. The roads passed through territory that had only recently been liberated, and pockets of bypassed German soldiers remained active in the countryside. Ambushes were a constant threat. A lone sniper could target a driver, or a hidden machine gun could rake a convoy as it passed through a wooded area. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, though severely weakened, still mounted sporadic raids, and a long, slow-moving convoy of trucks filled with fuel and ammunition made for a tempting target. The drivers were armed with rifles, but they were not trained combat infantry. Their best defense was to keep moving, to push through the danger zones as quickly as possible. The psychological toll of this constant, low-level threat was significant. Every shadow on the side of the road, every distant sound, could signal a potential attack. Yet, day after day, they climbed back into their cabs and started their engines. They were bound by a sense of duty and a powerful camaraderie. They looked out for one another. If a truck broke down, other drivers in the convoy would stop to help, sharing tools, spare parts, or simply a word of encouragement. They formed a unique brotherhood, a community forged on the dusty highways of France. The contribution of these men cannot be overstated. They delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies during the 82 days the Red Ball Express was in full operation. They were the critical link in the chain, the human element that made the whole system work. In their perseverance and dedication, they embodied the spirit of the operation, a relentless, forward-moving force that simply refused to be stopped. While the generals planned the strategy and the factories built the trucks, it was the drivers, through their sheer grit and unwavering commitment, who truly delivered the victory. Their legacy is not memorialized in grand statues, but in the unstoppable momentum of an army that, thanks to them, never ran out of fuel on its long road to liberation. Section 6. The Anatomy of the Red Road. The Red Ball Express was more than just a long line of trucks. It was a highly organized living system, a logistical artery with its own unique anatomy and rhythm. Its success depended on a complex interplay of rules, infrastructure, and constant human intervention. The architects of the operation understood that to move such an unprecedented volume of traffic, they couldn't just send trucks down a road. They had to transform the very nature of the roads themselves, creating a controlled, high-speed corridor through the chaos of a war zone. The most visible and iconic feature of this system was the signage. The routes were marked with large, unmistakable signs, bearing a solid red circle on a white background. These red balls were placed at every intersection, every fork in the road, and at regular intervals along the way, guiding the drivers and signaling to all other traffic that this road was off limits. The signs became a symbol of the operation's absolute priority. For a Red Ball driver, often disoriented by fatigue and the unfamiliar landscape, these red circles were a comforting and essential guide, a breadcrumb trail leading them toward their destination. The core principle of the system was the one-way loop. This was a stroke of logistical genius that prevented the kind of gridlock that would have doomed the operation. One major highway was designated for laden trucks heading east to the front. A separate, roughly parallel route was designated for empty trucks returning west to the ports. This created a continuous, circular flow, eliminating the need for trucks to pass each other in opposite directions on narrow roads. It was, in effect, the first major interstate highway system in Europe, created out of necessity and enforced by the military police. The military police corps played a crucial, if often overlooked, role. They were the traffic cops of the Red Ball Express. Stationed at checkpoints every few miles, they were responsible for keeping the convoys moving, preventing unauthorized vehicles from entering the restricted routes, and dealing with the inevitable breakdowns and accidents. They were the human regulators of the system, standing for hours on end in the dust and fumes, waving the trucks through with relentless efficiency. They also served as information hubs, relaying messages, providing directions to lost drivers, and reporting road conditions up and down the line. A strict set of rules of the road was enforced. Each convoy was to consist of a minimum of 5 trucks. They were instructed to maintain a constant speed, ideally 25 miles per hour, though this was often impossible on the poor road surfaces. A mandatory 60-yard interval was to be maintained between vehicles. This was a critical safety measure. It prevented chain reaction collisions if a truck suddenly stopped, and it also minimized the potential damage from an air attack or artillery shell, as a single explosion would be unlikely to take out more than one vehicle. Of course, maintaining this discipline in the dark, under a state of extreme fatigue, was a constant challenge for the drivers. To support this relentless movement, a network of support stations grew up along the routes. Bivouac and refueling areas were established where drivers could get a hot meal, perform minor maintenance on their trucks, and, if they were lucky, catch an hour or two of sleep. These were not rest stops in the civilian sense. They were brief, functional pauses in a near-continuous journey. The refueling process itself was a marvel of efficiency, with teams of soldiers working like a modern pit crew to get the trucks gassed up and back on the road as quickly as possible. The most critical support element was the Corps of Engineers. The roads of France had taken a terrible beating, first from years of neglect during the occupation, and then from the destructive effects of the fighting. They were pockmarked with shell craters, and many bridges had been destroyed. The engineers worked tirelessly, often just ahead of the lead convoys, to keep the routes passable. They operated bulldozers and graders to fill in craters and smooth out the roadbeds. They laid down corduroy roads of logs over muddy patches. Most importantly, they erected prefabricated Bailey bridges over rivers and streams where the original spans had been demolished. These portable steel truss bridges could be assembled with remarkable speed, allowing the engineers to literally build the road as the convoy advanced. The entire system was a demonstration of a holistic approach to logistics. It wasn't enough to have trucks and drivers. You needed dedicated roads, a policing force, a maintenance network, and a robust engineering component, all working in perfect synchronization. It was a self-contained ecosystem, a river of supply that carved its own channel through the landscape of war, nourishing the armies at its destination. The red ball sign was more than just a marker. It was a symbol of a promise that no matter how far or how fast the front lines moved, the tools needed for victory would always be there. Section 7. The River of Fire. Of all the cargo transported by the Red Ball Express, none was more critical, more volatile, or more symbolic of the nature of mechanized warfare than fuel. Gasoline and diesel were the lifeblood of the Allied armies. Every tank, every jeep, every self-propelled artillery piece, and every supply truck, including those of the Red Ball Express itself, was utterly dependent on a constant supply of it. The advance across France was, in the most literal sense, powered by this river of fire that flowed ceaselessly from the Normandy coast. The sheer scale of consumption was difficult to comprehend. A single M4 Sherman tank, the workhorse of the American armored divisions, had an operational range of only about 100 to 150 miles on a full tank of gasoline. In a single day of aggressive maneuvering and combat, an entire armored division could burn through hundreds of thousands of gallons. When General Patton's Third Army was at the peak of its charge, its daily fuel requirement exceeded 400,000 gallons. To meet this insatiable demand, the Red Ball Express had to dedicate a massive portion of its capacity to transporting fuel. The primary container for this precious liquid was the 5-gallon steel container known to American soldiers as the jerry can. The design had been copied from a superior German model captured early in the war. It was robust, easy to carry, and had an intelligent design with 3 handles, allowing one man to carry 2 empty cans or 2 men to carry a full one. Its airpipe spout allowed for smooth, quick pouring without gurgling, a small but significant detail when refueling a tank under pressure. The deuce-and-a-half trucks were loaded to capacity with these cans. A standard load might consist of hundreds of them, stacked high in the cargo bed, a heavy, sloshing cargo that reeked of gasoline. These trucks were, in effect, mobile powder kegs. The drivers were acutely aware of the danger they were carrying. A stray tracer bullet, a spark from a piece of shrapnel, or a simple traffic accident could instantly transform their vehicle into a raging inferno. There was a strict no-smoking policy for anyone near a fuel convoy, a rule that was enforced with the utmost seriousness. The sight of a Red Ball fuel convoy was awe-inspiring. It was a seemingly endless procession of trucks, each one representing thousands of gallons of combustible energy. As they rumbled down the dusty roads, they left a faint haze of diesel exhaust and gasoline fumes in their wake. For the combat soldiers at the front, the arrival of a fuel convoy was a moment of profound relief and renewed hope. It meant their tanks could move again, their attacks could resume, and the pressure on the enemy could be maintained. The sound of a deuce-and-a-half downshifting as it pulled into a forward supply depot was as welcome as the sound of friendly artillery. At its peak, the Red Ball Express was delivering over 1 million gallons of fuel to the front every single day. To put this in perspective, that is enough fuel to drive an average car around the Earth's equator more than 1,000 times. This staggering volume was achieved through sheer, unrelenting effort. The journey of a single jerry can of gasoline tells the story of the entire Allied logistical chain. It would begin in a tanker ship that had crossed the Atlantic from the United States. It would be piped ashore in Normandy, often through innovative systems like the pipeline under the ocean, Pluto. From there, it would be pumped into vast fuel dumps, where it was decanted into the 5-gallon jerry cans. Thousands of soldiers worked in these depots, a monotonous and hazardous job, filling, sealing, and loading the cans onto the Red Ball trucks. Then began the long, perilous journey eastward. Upon reaching a forward army supply point, the cans would be offloaded and distributed to the individual combat units. Finally, a tank crew would grab the cans and manually pour the contents into their vehicles' fuel tanks, often under the threat of enemy fire. This river of fuel was the ultimate enabler. It allowed the Allied armies to maintain the high-tempo, mobile warfare that was so crucial to their strategy. The German High Command, who had counted on the Allies outrunning their fuel supply, watched in disbelief as the American tanks kept coming, day after day, week after week. They could not fathom the logistical miracle that was making it possible. The Red Ball Express had effectively created an above-ground, mobile pipeline that directly countered the Germans' primary strategic hope. It demonstrated that the industrial might of the United States could not only produce the weapons of war, but could also deliver the energy to power them on a continental scale, overcoming any obstacle through sheer, overwhelming volume. The unassuming jerry can, multiplied by millions and transported by thousands of trucks, was the liquid ammunition that won the War of Mobility in France. Section 8. The German Realization. From fortified command posts and hastily dug foxholes, the German soldiers and their commanders watched the events of late August and early September 1944 with a growing sense of bewilderment and dread. Their entire strategy for the defense of France had been predicated on a simple, proven principle of warfare: the logistical exhaustion of the attacker. They had seen the American armored columns surge forward with incredible speed and had confidently waited for the inevitable pause, the moment when the advance would literally run out of gas. They had prepared their counter-moves, conserving their precious panzer divisions for the decisive blow against a stalled and vulnerable enemy. But the pause never came. Day after day, fresh intelligence reports would arrive, each one more confounding than the last. Patton's tanks were still moving. Bradley's infantry were still advancing. The front line continued to creep eastward, with an unnatural, relentless consistency. The expected sputtering halt had been replaced by a steady, grinding momentum. The German generals, men who prided themselves on their mastery of military science, were confronted with a phenomenon that defied their calculations. How was it possible? Their own experiences on the Eastern Front had taught them that such a rapid advance, over such distances, with such a degraded infrastructure, was logistically unsustainable. They began to receive reports from reconnaissance patrols and Luftwaffe pilots about massive, unending truck convoys moving along the main French highways. They were described as endless snakes of olive-drab vehicles, rumbling eastward day and night. Initially, These convoys were seen as prime targets. German artillery, when in range, would shell the roads. Luftwaffe fighter bombers, on the rare occasions they could achieve local air superiority, would strafe the columns. Ambushes were set by bypassed units. But these attacks, while causing localized damage and creating temporary chaos, had almost no discernible effect on the overall flow of supplies. For every truck that was knocked out, it seemed there were 100 more right behind it to take its place. If a bridge was blown, mobile engineering units would appear as if from nowhere and have a temporary span in place within hours. The convoys would simply navigate around the wreckage and continue on their way. The Germans began to refer to the source of this logistical flood as the invisible suppliers. It was as if the supplies were materializing at the front by magic. They couldn't see the whole system, the ports, the depots, the maintenance stations, the one-way loops. All they saw was the end result: American tanks that never seemed to run out of fuel and artillery that never seemed to run out of shells. This had a profound psychological effect on the German troops. They were fighting a retreating battle against an enemy that seemed to possess infinite resources. It felt less like a war against an army and more like a war against a force of nature, an industrial avalanche that was slowly and inexorably burying them. The German soldier was known for his resilience and fighting prowess, but he was also a pragmatist. He could understand being outfought, but being overwhelmed by sheer material superiority was a different matter. It bred a sense of futility, a feeling that no amount of courage or tactical skill could stand against such an opponent. The failure of the Allied logistical chain had been the cornerstone of the German defensive strategy. When it became clear that this cornerstone was not going to crumble, their entire strategic posture became untenable. The planned, decisive counterattack never materialized because the perfect moment never arrived. The Allied armies were never stalled, never vulnerable in the way the Germans had anticipated. Instead, the German forces were kept constantly off balance, forced to react to Allied thrusts, unable to regain the initiative. By mid-September, the realization had fully set in within the German high command. They were not facing a traditional European army bound by the old rules of logistics. They were facing a new kind of military power, one that had harnessed its industrial base to solve the problem of supply on a scale they had never imagined. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, their own revolutionary contribution to modern warfare, was based on creating a logistical crisis for the enemy. Now, they were on the receiving end of a strategy that had effectively made logistics its primary weapon. The Red Ball Express had not just supplied an army. It had dismantled the enemy's entire strategic and psychological framework. It was a victory won not on a single battlefield, but over hundreds of miles of broken road, a triumph of organization and industrial will that left its opponents confused, demoralized, and ultimately defeated. The steady drone of the deuce-and-a-half engines, heard faintly in the distance, became the soundtrack of their retreat. Section 9. The Fruits of the Express, Paris, and the Push to the Rhine. The tangible impact of the Red Ball Express was not measured in statistics or tonnage reports, but in the liberation of towns, the capture of territory, and the steady, eastward march of the Allied front line. Every can of gasoline and every crate of ammunition delivered by the tireless drivers translated directly into military success on the ground. The operation was the silent partner in some of the most celebrated victories of the campaign in France. Perhaps the most symbolic of these was the liberation of Paris. By the middle of August 1944, Allied forces were encircling the French capital. The initial strategic plan had been to bypass the city, to avoid a protracted and destructive urban battle. However, as an uprising by the French resistance began within Paris and political pressure mounted, General Eisenhower made the decision to take the city. The honor was given to the French 2nd Armored Division, under General Philippe Leclerc, supported by the American 4th Infantry Division. This advance on Paris was a significant logistical undertaking. It required a dedicated stream of fuel and supplies to be diverted to these specific units, ensuring they had the momentum to push through the German defenses, ringing the city. The Red Ball Express, which had just begun its operations, was immediately tasked with supporting this crucial thrust. Convoys were routed to the staging areas for the advance, delivering the high-octane gasoline needed to fuel Leclerc's Sherman tanks and the rations and ammunition for the infantry. On August 25, 1944, French and American forces entered Paris to the jubilant cheers of its citizens. This momentous event, a massive boost to Allied morale and a devastating blow to German prestige, was made possible by the logistical pipeline that was humming to life behind them. Following the liberation of Paris, the Allied armies continued their breathtaking pursuit of the retreating German forces. This was the phase of the campaign where the Red Ball Express proved its absolute indispensability. General Patton's Third Army, in particular, was engaged in a massive, sweeping armored advance across eastern France, heading towards the German border. Patton's philosophy of war was built on speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. He famously remarked that he wanted his soldiers to have guts and gasoline. The Red Ball Express provided the gasoline. During this period, the Third Army was often at the absolute end of the supply chain, the furthest and most difficult customer to serve. Its very success created enormous logistical challenges. Yet, day after day, the convoys found their way to Patton's forward supply depots. There were times when the situation was desperate, when tank columns were literally halted in their tracks, their engines silent, waiting for the arrival of the next fuel convoy. The drivers of the Red Ball Express, understanding the urgency, would push themselves and their vehicles to the breaking point to make the delivery. The ability of the Express to sustain this advance prevented the Germans from establishing a new, coherent defensive line in France. They were kept in a constant state of retreat, unable to rest, refit, and dig in. The advance was so rapid that it stretched the supply line to its absolute maximum length of over 400 miles. By late September, the Allied armies had reached the borders of Germany itself, an achievement that would have been utterly impossible without the continuous flow of supplies provided by the Red Ball Express. The operation allowed the Allies to fully capitalize on the breakout from Normandy, turning a tactical victory into a strategic rout of the German army in France. It sustained the advance all the way to Lorraine and the edges of the Ardennes forest. While the advance would eventually slow in the autumn due to worsening weather, the stiffening of German resistance near their own border, and the eventual need to open closer ports like Antwerp, the legacy of the Red Ball Express was already secure. For 82 critical days, it had been the engine of the Allied pursuit. It had fueled the liberation of a nation and carried the Allied armies to the doorstep of the Third Reich. The drivers who had spent countless hours on the dusty roads of France could look at a map of Europe and see the direct result of their labor in the vast swathes of liberated territory. They had not fired the guns or driven the tanks, but they had delivered the means for victory, ensuring that the momentum of liberation, once gained, was never lost. Section 10. The Legacy of the Red Road. The Red Ball Express officially ceased its main operations on November 16, 1944. By then, the strategic situation had changed. The port of Antwerp had been opened, providing a much closer and higher capacity entry point for supplies. The French railway system was slowly being repaired and brought back into service, offering a more efficient means of transporting bulk goods over long distances. The frantic, high-speed pursuit across France was over, replaced by a more methodical and attritional battle along the German frontier. The urgent, desperate need for the massive, round-the-clock truck convoy system had passed. But in its 82 days of operation, The Red Ball Express had etched itself into the annals of military history. Its achievements were staggering. In less than 3 months, it had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies to the front lines. It had proven that a modern, mechanized army could be sustained in a rapid advance over vast distances, effectively solving the fundamental paradox that had plagued commanders for centuries. The operation's legacy is multifaceted. Strategically, it was a war winner. It was the critical enabler that allowed the Allies to exploit the Normandy breakout to its fullest potential, leading to the liberation of France and Belgium in a fraction of the time military planners had anticipated. It directly countered and defeated the German strategy of waiting for a logistical collapse. It demonstrated that in 20th century warfare, logistics were not merely a supporting element, but a co-equal, and sometimes decisive, component of combat power. The German army's blitzkrieg concept was predicated on speed and surprise, but the Red Ball Express showed that American ingenuity could create a system of blitz logistics that was even more powerful, based on endurance and overwhelming volume. From a technical and organizational perspective, the Red Ball Express was a landmark achievement. It was a testament to American planning, improvisation, and industrial might. It showcased the reliability of its workhorse, the GMC deuce-and-a-half truck, and the incredible skill of the engineers who kept the roads open. It served as a blueprint for future military logistical operations, its lessons studied in military academies for decades to come. The concept of dedicated, high-priority supply routes and the importance of a holistic support system became fundamental tenets of modern military doctrine. Perhaps its most profound legacy, however, is a human one. The Red Ball Express is the story of the thousands of soldiers, particularly the African American drivers, who performed one of the most arduous and essential jobs of the war. In their grueling, non-stop effort, they demonstrated a level of dedication and professionalism that was second to none. Their contribution was a powerful statement of skill and patriotism, a vital part of the war effort that, for many years, did not receive the recognition it deserved. The Red Ball Express helped to subtly challenge the segregated mindset of the era, proving that performance on the battlefield, or in this case, the road to the battlefield, was not determined by race. The experience of working in the integrated, high-pressure environment of the Express had a lasting impact on many of the soldiers involved. In the end, the Red Ball Express was more than a convoy route. It was a symbol. It symbolized the industrial power of the United States, a nation that could produce vehicles and fuel on a scale that its enemies could not comprehend. It symbolized American ingenuity, the ability to create a complex, innovative solution to a seemingly impossible problem on the fly. And most importantly, it symbolized the unwavering perseverance of the common soldier, the driver, who, through endless days and nights, kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, carrying the hope of liberation in the back of his truck. The rumble of those thousands of engines has long since faded into history, but the legacy of the Red Road endures as a timeless lesson in how determination, organization, and the relentless spirit of ordinary people can change the course of history.